Pieter de Hooch was an artist working in Delft and was definitely part of the Delft school in the 17th century, a group of artists who focused on creating calming works with an emphasis on beautiful, natural, light-filled spaces with adjoining perspectives and a lot of times cooler, more silvery tones. He's at his height of popularity in the late 1650s and into the 1660s when he's doing a lot of genre scenes that really fit in with the characteristics of those produced by the Delft School. He did struggle financially, however, and ended up going to Amsterdam in the early 1660s, which didn't really seem to improve the situation, and in fact, many of his later works lose a little bit of their charm. Some scholars, like Peter Sutton, believe that likely the women and children that appear in de Hooch's works are likely modeled after his own wife and son, and the familiar rooms that we see probably modeled after those of his own house. Even if they aren't strictly modeled on that, he was definitely informed by his own experience when he came to painting his works. In this brief explanation, we're going to take a look at two of Pieter de Hooch's works that focus on portraying figures within a courtyard. His family in a courtyard from 1657 to 60, and his maid with a child in a courtyard in Delft from 1658. In both of these works, you can see de Hooch's interest in portraying adjoining perspectives. And in fact, courtyards during this point in history were actually connected as we're seeing them portrayed here. The figure with his back towards us in the other courtyard walking away suggests a recession into space. It was a way for de Hooch to show off his skill. And even though the perspective ground plane isn't quite right, maybe seems a little bit steep, instead of receding in a completely believable way, artists in Delft were very much interested in trying to portray ordered space. Courtyards were actually important architectural features during this time in history. A lot of times in the Dutch Republic, they had narrow houses with really deep lots. And so these courtyards were kind of an extension of the living space behind the houses. Most likely, these ones in particular don't represent an actual location, but they're very much based likely on the views of the courtyards and the backyards that de Hooch would have experienced as he lived in the west side of Delft himself. But these courtyards weren't just a reference to actual daily Dutch living, they had some symbolic references too. They very much drew on the tradition of portraying Mary in an enclosed garden, and those traditions that were suggestive of her purity. And in fact, the roses that we see in the back corner of this courtyard seem to kind of bring to mind that parallel with Mary even further. We very often see these kinds of parallels with earlier Catholic imagery and contemporary, more secularized Protestant Dutch imagery. There was this kind of extension of earlier motifs that had been used to portray Mary, and they had been transformed in the 17th century as a way to exemplify to women model motherhood. So it was part of this whole tradition in the Dutch 17th century of celebrating the virtue of ordinary, hard-working women and their contributions in their families and how that built up the Republic. This work seems to emphasize that by including the Neue Kerk, the new church of Delft, in the background, a distance present there whose distinctive tower is seen kind of rising above the orange-tiled rooftops of Delft. And the whole idea that the mother should train up her children as a good Protestant, just as if she were kind of running a mini church that made the foundation of the Dutch nation, was very popular in the Dutch Republic at this time. It's the whole idea of a kleine kerk, and we see that very often being communicated in these family types of portraits. And this is likely a family portrait. The figures are detailed, they're specific, they look alike, so they are probably a family. In addition to looking alike, there are a lot of messages that seem to suggest that these are a family group as well. The two most obvious symbols that relate to the way this family functions would be the grapes held by the mother and the apple held by the sister. So Dutch scholar Eddie de Jong talks of grape symbolism in the 17th century. If we were looking in a Catholic country like Flanders, obviously grapes would refer to the Eucharist, but what would they have meant to the Dutch? Why would the grapes be important? The woman here picks them up by the stems and then looks to her husband as though she is kind of looking maybe for his direction or indicating some sort of message to him. The other figures look to the artist instead of interacting with each other in the same way. Now, this motif of holding the grapes by the stem stem was actually one that was used in other portraits of the day, and it stems from some contemporary literature, from Jakob Katz and his seminal text, Houwelijk, which was a text all about women, the stages of life women would experience, and the proper kind of code of conduct women should adhere to throughout all of those stages of life. In this text, there was an illustration that opened up the section on maidenhood. The hand of God reached down and grabbed some grapes by the stem instead of grabbing the grapes directly. And the whole idea here was that young women needed to be taken by the stem from maidenhood through marriage so that their grapes would not be crushed. And contemporary viewers would have been kind of familiar with that, especially if they were familiar with the emblematic imagery of the day. They would have understood not only the reference to Jakob Katz in marriage, but they also would have understood grapes as a symbol of fertility and fecundity. So if we're looking at it in the context of this image, we should understand that this woman, as the mother of the family, was one who was using her fertility correctly in marriage. She was only having relations with her husband, and then only for the sake of children, which was very kind of Protestant outlook of the day. The dog sitting at the foot of the table seems to emphasize this same point. For a long time in art history, the dog has been a symbol of fidelity and loyalty, just as this woman is faithful and loyal to her husband. In addition to the grapes, we also see the daughter holding an apple, which may relate to her role as the offspring, and that she would further on this line. So there's a couple of ideas here. Very often, there was this idea of training children up just as you would kind of train up the plants in your garden, like a fruit tree. You should weed them, you should prune them, you should nourish them. And by doing this, you would be a good mother. So there's definitely the message of that coming with this apple included. And the fact that she is the sister in this family seems to also refer to the way that she will bring forth fruit her own. She will continue this family line. She will continue this family tradition of being a wife and mother that trains children up. So these are all ways that these female figures are trying to show themselves as virtuous, or trying to show themselves in an ideal light. In fact, the sister holding up the apple is even lifting up her skirts to show her fashionable kind of silk underskirt beneath. So lots of different techniques used here to idealize the figures and make them look attractive and positive. So all in all, we're seeing a message here about the role of women in the family, the role they had to protect their families as though they're keeping them safe in a little courtyard, and to train them up to use their fertility positively in a marital relationship, and all in all, to just be a good little Protestant family. Another work where de Hooch kind of emphasizes the positive role of women in training up children by using a courtyard setting is A Maid with a Child in a Courtyard of Delft. This is a kind of extension of domestic living. When we see these courtyard spaces, they were places that the Dutch used and places where the Dutch lived their daily lives. And here, rather than focusing on something that seems to be really topographically accurate, de Hooch here is giving us something that's very picturesque, and the Dutch appreciated the picturesque in artwork. They called it schilderachtig, and essentially they felt like that we could capture the experience of daily life, the kind of timelessness of the routine of women's work in the household, and the way that they kind of contributed to a sense of happiness and of satisfaction. The way the brick here is very weathered, the plaster on the walls kind of showing through, the way we see all of these little touches gives it a real sense of something calming and peaceful and pleasant. And the message that we seem to be picking up on in this work also seems pleasant. The tablet here at the top, which still exists in an Amsterdam museum, refers to the teachings of St. Jerome, which says essentially that if you want to be able to be raised spiritually, you should live a humble life, you should be patient, you should be meek. And the maid, we can tell here by her dress, who's holding the hand of the child, seems to take a step downward. So it's like this metaphor for humility, right? Descending in her life, descending the stairs, and a way then to refer to this quote and her wish to be spiritually raised through her humility. Now, interestingly, servants in Dutch works during this century are are varied in the way that they're portrayed. De Hooch seem to be fairly virtuous on the whole. They're not naughty, they're not lazy, they're not there to tempt the master of the house, which is something that we see in other works. In fact, contemporary legislation of the day even listed what was desired behavior from servants and what was not. But some scholars actually think that de Hooch may have had a time when he was a servant himself, and that may have affected the way that he approached portraying maids and servants, and seems to be putting them in this positive light in the majority of his works. And here she is leading the child while the woman of the house stands looking out the doorway, and she is leading her in a positive direction. The broom at the bottom seems to emphasize that message. It was a symbol for moral cleanliness. It was kind of this reference to an old standing idea that Christ would sweep one's heart clean. And so here she is, an example of moral virtue to this young child that she has in her care. So when we look at the overall message of this work, in conjunction with the other work where de Hooch uses courtyards to portray something positive about the figures in his work, the ideas are definitely about the contributions that women make, whether they're maids, whether they're mothers, whether they're soon-to-be mothers, in the lives of raising up these good Dutch little citizens to be strong Protestants that can contribute to the good of the nation.